The story of the United States is a long one, not made of sudden triumphs or quick discoveries, but of slow movement across wide land and endless years of work and waiting. It began before there was any idea of a nation, before borders or flags or presidents, when the land was only wind and grass and rivers that wound quietly between trees that had stood since before memory. The people who first walked across the land came not in armies or with plans, but in small groups, following the animals and the seasons. They built fires that smoked in the cold and spoke to one another in voices that carried through the forest. They fished in the rivers and carved stones into tools that were heavy and blunt. They learned the shape of the earth beneath their feet and how to grow what would feed them in the soil that changed with every mile. When others came across the sea, they did not arrive quickly, but slowly, over months, on ships that creaked and leaked and swayed with the long roll of the Atlantic. They were not thinking of freedom or democracy. They were thinking of survival, of food and shelter, and not freezing when the first winter came. They cut trees for homes and burned their furniture to stay warm. They saw fields that looked empty but were not. The people who had lived there for thousands of years watched from the woods, unsure if these newcomers would stay or go. The first villages were quiet at night. The sound of the wind on wooden roofs, the cry of wolves, and the slow rhythm of waves on the shore. The land was big and the people were few, and the distance between them was greater than they could imagine. Over time, more came from across the sea. Some searching for gold, others for a place where no one could tell them how to pray. They built small towns that grew into larger ones, with roads that turned into lines of trade and arguments about who owned what. The soil in the south was rich and dark. The winters there were soft and long, while in the north the ground froze hard and made men cut wood and save grain. The difference between them began to shape how they thought about work and freedom and people. When they began to think of themselves not as Englishmen, but as something else, something new, that lived on the edge of a vast land that stretched too far to see, it was not a sudden thought, but a slow realization that they had grown different from the people who sent them across the sea. They were still bound by laws they did not make, and taxes they did not vote for, and kings they had never seen. Men began to speak in taverns and meeting houses about independence, though the word itself was heavy and dangerous, and few were brave enough to say it aloud. When they did, the war that came was long and uncertain, fought in mud and rain and frost, with hunger and fear on both sides. Men marched in coats too thin and shoes too worn for the cold. They fought not for glory, but for an idea that even they did not fully understand, that they could govern themselves and make their own mistakes. When it was over, the new nation was small and fragile, a handful of states loosely tied together by words on paper, words that promised liberty but left much unclear. The years that followed were filled with talk and compromise and argument about how much power a government should have, how much it should take, and how much it should leave alone. The first presidents walked carefully through this new arrangement. Washington spoke little, but carried a silence that felt heavier than speeches. He knew the people feared kings, and he did not wish to look like one. So he stepped down when he could have stayed, setting a pattern that would hold for centuries. The land beyond the mountains called to others. It was quiet and wide and full of promise. Men moved west with wagons that broke and wheels that sank into mud. They built fences and farms and towns that rose and fell in the span of a few short years. The native people who had lived there long before were pushed aside, slowly at first, then violently, and always the land changed hands faster than it could rest. The expansion of the country was not noble or clean. It was filled with treaties broken and promises forgotten, but the idea of progress kept moving forward, like a river that does not stop for stones in its way. As the century turned, machines began to hum and smoke rose from factories where once there had only been fields. The cities grew taller and louder and filled with the smell of iron and oil. Men worked long hours for small pay, and children carried lunch pails through streets lined with brick and soot. The North and the South grew further apart, not just in distance, but in what they believed. One spoke of freedom and progress, the other of tradition and right, and both used the same words to mean different things. The question of slavery hung over every decision, like a shadow that stretched from one coast to the other. And when it could no longer be ignored, it broke the country apart. The war that came was long and gray, and filled with hunger and mud and loss. Brothers fought brothers, and cities burned, and fields turned red with blood that soaked the earth deep. The soldiers on both sides believed they were fighting for the soul of the nation, though few could have explained exactly what that meant. When it ended, the land was quiet again, but scarred. The people were tired and uncertain, and though slavery was ended, equality was not born. The years that followed were full of rebuilding, of slow and uneven progress, of promises made and forgotten. Railroads crossed the continent, and towns appeared where there had once been only prairie. The West became a myth of freedom and danger, a place where men went to escape the past and start again, though most found the same hard work waiting for them under a different sky. The country grew not through peace, but through motion, the constant movement of people chasing opportunity. Industry rose, and with it came new problems, new kinds of poverty and power. Factories lit the night with fire and smoke. Immigrants arrived from every direction, carrying languages and dreams that filled the streets of New York and Chicago and Boston. They lived crowded in tenements where the air was thick and the rooms small, but they believed in the promise of something better, even if they rarely saw it themselves. The presidents came and went, some remembered, some forgotten. The flag changed stars as new states joined the Union, each one carved from land taken by force or by treaty that never lasted. The century turned again, and with it came invention, the hum of electricity, the birth of cars, the slow crawl of cities into the modern age. Yet beneath it all, the same quiet struggles remained. Who owned what? Who deserved more? Who belonged and who did not? The great wars of the world came, and the United States marched into them with noise and pride. Young men crossed oceans to fight in places they could barely find on maps. They came home changed or did not come home at all. The factories that built weapons turned to building everything else. Cars, radios, refrigerators, cities grew higher, their lights glowing through smog. The country seemed unstoppable, but under the surface it was restless. The crash came not with thunder, but with silence. Markets fell, jobs disappeared, farms went dry, and the people lined up for bread that ran out too soon. The government tried to hold the pieces together, to promise that things would get better, though few believed it for years, until the next war came, pulling the country back into motion again. Factories roared, soldiers marched, women worked in places they had never been allowed before, and when it ended, the country stood different, richer, stronger, but still divided by things too old to vanish soon. The long war of ideas began, fought not on battlefields but in whispers and spies and speeches. The Cold War turned fear into policy and suspicion into routine. People built shelters underground and stared at the sky, wondering if it would fall. The country spread its reach across the world and argued with itself about what freedom meant.
The movements at home grew louder. Voices rose against segregation and war and poverty. The streets filled with marches and music and words that demanded to be heard. Some changes came slowly, others not at all. The presidents again came and went, each one trying to hold together a nation that was always in motion, always unfinished. The years rolled on through victories and scandals, through wars that never fully ended and peace that never fully held. The people watched screens that told them who they were supposed to be and what to fear next. Technology crept into every corner of life until silence became rare and stillness felt strange. The old factories rusted and the new economy appeared without smoke or steel, but full of invisible connections.